The first snow came early to the Montana Territory that year, swirling through the cottonwoods like ash from an unseen fire. It whispered down over the ridges and folds of the land, quieting the world to breath and hoofbeats, blanketing the hills before the earth had even hardened to frost. By the time Clara Langley crossed the state line on a mule, she'd traded her mother's brooch to a stable boy for the wind had teeth, and the sky hung low with the threat of worse to come. She did not look back, not when she left the flatlands of Kansas behind, not when the rising sun caught the steeple of her father's chapel one last time, nor when the ache in her thighs made her consider the warmth of the hearth she'd fled. What waited there was a wedding dress stiff with starch and silence, a man 20 years her senior with hard hands and no kindness in his mouth. Her mother had wept, but not for Clara, for the family name, the appearances, the dowry lost if Clara refused. Her father had not wept. He had raised his hand, and Clara had left with its shadow still fresh on her cheek. The road she took was not a road at all but a deer trail threading through the high country. By the third day her hands were raw from the reins, and her lips bled where the wind split them. Still she rode. Her mule, an old gray with a sway back and one milky eye, kept its head down and plodded forward with the resigned patience of something used to being left behind. She named him Samson, and sang to him when her own silence grew too loud. On the fifth night the storm came. She saw the clouds gather like wolves, low and gray, and by dusk the snow fell in earnest, thick and wet, weighing down the branches of the pines like grief. She planned to make it to a town by then, just a name on a map, Elkhorn, where maybe she could find work in a kitchen or sewing room. But she was still 2 ridgelines short, and the wind was rising fast. Her fingers were too stiff to light a fire. She found a narrow copse of trees that curved like ribs and coaxed Samson into the shelter of them. She wrapped her skirts around her legs and curled into the mule's warmth, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken since childhood, prayers her mother used to murmur while scrubbing the hearth. That's where he found her. She heard him first, a crunch of snow, a shift in the stillness. Her body tensed but did not rise. Then came the voice, low and rough as old leather. "You'll freeze to death out here." She turned slowly, unsure if he was real. A man stood at the edge of the copse, dusted in snow like a statue. His hat was pulled low, scarf wound tight around his jaw, but his eyes were pale and sharp in the dusk. He looked like the storm, cold, carved, full of something vast and unspoken. "I'm not looking for company," she said, voice cracking. He didn't move, didn't say I was offering any, but there's a cabin half a mile east. You come or you don't. And then he turned and walked away. She watched him disappear into the snow, his coat the color of dried blood. Her breath came hard, shallow. She thought of dying out here, of how quickly the body went still when the cold found it. She thought of the wedding band she had thrown into the river 3 towns back, of the bruises on her heart and hands. Then she rose, knees trembling, and followed him. The cabin was older than sin and twice as weathered, half buried in a snowdrift with a crooked chimney spitting smoke. He held the door open just long enough for her to slip inside, then shut it against the storm. The warmth hit her like a blow. Her knees gave and she sank to the floor, breath tearing out of her. She felt the man move past her, silent as dusk, shedding his coat and hanging it near the fire. The hearth blazed with cedar and pine. A pot of beans simmered, and the scent made her stomach cramp with hunger. She looked up finally and saw him clearly. He was young, no more than 30, but something in his face bore the weight of long winters. His hair was dark, beard full, clothes mended but clean. He did not ask her name, did not offer his, just handed her a mug of hot water and turned back to the fire. She drank, her hands shook. "Why'd you come?" he asked after a long while. She stared into the flames, "Because I didn't want to die." He nodded, as if that was the only reason that mattered. Silence filled the space between them, heavy but not unkind. She watched the way his shoulders moved as he tended the fire, the quiet reverence in his gestures. There was grief on him like a coat he hadn't taken off yet. She didn't ask about it. She knew the shape of sorrow too well to demand its story. When he finally spoke again, his voice was softer. "You can stay tonight. Storm's gonna get worse before it gets better." She nodded. He spread a blanket on the floor near the fire for her, then took the chair by the hearth himself. As she lay there, watching snow crowd the window pane, she felt something inside her unclench, not trust, not yet, but the memory of it. Outside, the wind howled like something ancient and wounded. Inside, the silence settled like a truce. Morning came slow and gray, the kind of light that blurred edges and left the world hushed. Clara stirred beneath the blanket, the warmth of the fire having faded to a dull orange glow. Her body ached from the cold and the floor's hardness, but she was still breathing, and for that alone she felt a flicker of something like gratitude. The man was already awake. He stood by the window, staring out through the frost-laced glass. Snow reached halfway up the door now, and more still fell in steady, muffled waves. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "We're socked in, might be days." She sat up slowly, clutching the blanket to her chest. Her hair was wild around her shoulders, and the hems of her dress were stiff with ice. She waited for fear to rise again, but it didn't come. Only a bone-deep weariness, like she'd been running too long to keep being afraid. "I'll help," she said. He turned then, eyebrows lifted in surprise, not mocking, just measuring. "Help what?" "Whatever needs doing." He hesitated. "You cook." "Well enough not to poison anyone." He grunted. "That'll do." She stood, legs stiff, and crossed to the hearth. There was half a loaf of bread, hardened at the edges, and a tin of lard on the shelf above. She busied herself with the fire first, feeding it kindling from a stack he must have cut and hauled before the storm hit. Her fingers were clumsy, but not useless. He watched her work, not closely, not like a man watching a woman for the curve of her waist or the slope of her collarbone, but the way someone watches a stranger hold their tools, assessing, wondering how long she meant to stay. When she asked where the flour was, he pointed with his chin. They moved around each other like two people on a narrow path, no words wasted. By the time the biscuits were in the pan and the coffee was boiling, the silence between them had shifted, less guarded, more shared. She glanced at him over her shoulder. "What's your name?" He looked up from where he was mending a harness near the table. "Jonah." She nodded. "Clara." That was all they said. Over breakfast, she studied him without meaning to. He ate slow, like a man used to eating alone, chewing each bite as if remembering something. His hands were work-worn, the nails cracked and stained, but careful. There was a scar along his jaw, pale against his skin, and another at the base of his throat, half hidden by the collar of his shirt. He caught her looking and didn't flinch, just met her eyes and held them, something unspoken passing between them. Not invitation, not yet, just a kind of recognition. After they ate, he handed her a brush. "You ever groom a horse?" "I have now." He smiled, faint and crooked, like he hadn't used the muscles in some time. The barn was buried to the rafters on one side, but inside it was warm with the breath of the animals. There were two horses, a chestnut gelding with a white blaze and a smaller bay mare, both well kept but restless from the storm. Jonah worked in silence, shoveling feed from a bin, while Clara moved from flank to flank, brushing until her arms burned. It was the first time in days she felt useful. They worked until the light began to dim again. The snow hadn't stopped. If anything, it had grown thicker, the wind rising in sharp, guttural gusts that shook the shutters. Jonah closed the barn with a grunt, and they trudged back to the cabin, boots heavy, breath pluming in the air. Inside, the warmth felt hard-earned. That night they spoke more, not much, just scattered bits of who they were before the snow, offered like dry twigs to a fire neither of them knew how to build yet. "Was a ranch hand down near Sheridan," Jonah said, his voice low, "till last spring." "What happened?" He stared at the fire, jaw tight. "Fire came fast, took the barn, the house, my brother, his wife." Clara's hands went still in her lap. "I'm sorry," she said. He nodded once. "Not your doing." She didn't ask more. Loss had its own weight. Her own rose up then, unbidden. The face of the man her father had chosen for her, the sound of her mother's crying as she packed, the way her sisters had stood silent by the doorway, eyes turned to the floor. Jonah must have seen something shift in her face, because he asked, quietly, "You running from someone?" She didn't answer right away. The fire crackled. Wind whistled between the logs of the cabin. "Yes," she said finally, "but not for fear of being found, for fear of being kept." He didn't press, didn't ask for names or details or reasons, just gave her a slow, steady nod and looked away. Later, as she lay again on the blanket near the fire and he settled back into the chair, she watched his eyes drift shut, his breath even out. He did not snore. He slept like a man used to waking at the slightest sound. She didn't sleep for a long time. Just lay there, listening to the storm batter the world outside and the quiet rhythm of another life, not her own, moving nearby. When her eyes did close, she dreamed not of home or of the man waiting back in Kansas with the iron ring and harder voice, but of the sound of Jonah's boots in the snow, of the way silence, when shared, could feel like shelter. By the third day, the storm had quieted to a hush, like it had emptied itself at last. Snow lay deep and heavy across the land, smooth as untouched parchment. The sky held a brittle sort of blue, the kind that comes after grief, where light falls hard and sharp on everything it touches. Inside the cabin, breath no longer fogged in the air, and Clara found herself moving without thought to where things belonged, hanging her shawl by the door, folding blankets neatly, laying the tinware out to dry. She told herself it was habit, not hope. But the way Jonah stepped around her now, the way he left space for her at the table, said something different. They did not speak of staying. Neither asked how long the snow would keep them. But the days shaped themselves into a rhythm, quiet and spare. He split wood and hauled water. She kept the fire fed and meals warming. They spoke little, but their silence grew softer, lined with shared glances and the occasional flicker of dry humor. On the fifth morning, the horses were restless enough to need a proper walk. Jonah saddled the chestnut and took Clara on the mare, leading her down the old logging path that wound through the trees beyond the ridge. The snow muffled everything, and their breath hung in the still air like smoke. "It'll be weeks before the pass clears," he said, guiding the gelding carefully between drifts. "Maybe longer." She nodded, and Elkhorn. Still a ways off, 2 days by horse, maybe more in this mess. She thought of the map she'd carried in her boot, now folded into some corner of her satchel. A town she had never seen, a name she had clung to like a promise. She should have felt trapped. She didn't. As they rode, the trees gave way to a clearing. The sun, pale and distant, touched the snow in patches, casting a shimmer like crushed glass. Jonah dismounted and helped her down, his hands warm through his gloves. He pointed toward the far edge of the clearing, where a wooden cross stood, half buried in the drift. "My brother," he said, voice quiet. Clara didn't move. The air felt sacred still. "I couldn't leave him, not after the fire. Buried him here when the ground was still soft." She watched him remove his hat, snow melting along the brim. "They had a boy," he said. 5, didn't make it out." Clara felt something shift in her chest, a weight, not her own, that she still carried all the same. "I'm sorry," she said again. "I know." He looked at her then, and there was no wall in his eyes, just the ache of someone who had loved and lost and kept going anyway. She stepped forward and knelt, brushing snow from the base of the cross. Her breath caught in her throat, not for the dead, but for the man who had stayed behind to remember them. They rode back in silence, but something had changed. Not the snow, not the land, but the way Jonah's horse edged closer to hers. The way he didn't pull his hand back quite as fast when he helped her down at the cabin. That evening, she took a pot of water to heat and caught him watching her from the doorway. "You're good at this," he said. She raised an eyebrow, hauling water. "Being here, making it feel like something, still living." Clara didn't know what to say. The fire cracked, and she turned back to it, unsure what she would find in his eyes if she looked too long. Later, when she thought he'd gone to sleep, she stepped outside. The sky above was clear, stars hanging low and sharp. The snow stretched silver in every direction, a sea with no shore. She wrapped her shawl tighter and closed her eyes, breathing in the cold. Footsteps crunched behind her. "You'll catch your death," Jonah said, but not unkindly. "I just needed to see the sky." He came to stand beside her, arms crossed, eyes on the horizon. "Storm like that," he murmured, "it makes you think the sky might never come back." She nodded. They stood together, shoulder to shoulder, saying nothing more. And for a moment, under all that vastness, Clara felt the knot inside her loosen. She didn't know what came next. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't need to. The thaw came not with fanfare, but with the slow drip of melting snow from the eaves and the hush of icicles breaking loose at midday. By the time the creek near the cabin murmured again beneath its ice, Clara and Jonah had lived beside each other long enough to stop counting days. The storm had passed, but neither rushed to speak of leaving. Jonah busied himself with repairs, mending the barn's sagging beam, rechinking the cabin walls, sharpening blades dulled by winter. Clara helped where she could, her hands roughening, her back learning the language of honest ache. She wore a spare pair of trousers he loaned her, cinched at the waist with a strip of cloth, and though the first time he saw her in them he blinked twice and looked away, he said nothing but they'll hold better in the stirrups. They began to talk more easily. Over meals, over work, stories of places they'd been, people they'd known. Never the full truth, not all at once, but enough to build a scaffolding of trust. One afternoon, Clara found a bundle of cloth tucked high in the rafters, small and faded, wrapped tight with twine. She almost didn't open it, but curiosity got the better of her. Inside were baby clothes, a hand-stitched shirt, too small for anything but memory, a rattle carved from pine. She sat back on her heels, her throat tight. Jonah's voice came from behind her. I couldn't burn them. She turned slowly. He stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, his face unreadable. It's not my place, she said softly, starting to retie the bundle. He crossed the room and knelt beside her, took the shirt in his hands like it might dissolve. My nephews, I made that rattle when they told me they were expecting. Thought I'd teach him how to ride, fish, how to read the stars. His voice caught. Then the fire came, and all that was left was ash and these. She laid a hand on his. They'd want them kept, she said. They'd want someone to remember. He nodded slowly, and they wrapped the bundle again together. He didn't speak the rest of the day, but when he passed her a plate that night, his fingers brushed hers and lingered. Spring came sudden, as it does in the high country. One morning, birdsong threaded through the trees, and the snow shrank back from the cabin like a defeated thing. Shoots of green broke through earth thought frozen for good. The road to Elkhorn, Jonah said, would be passable soon. Clara sat on the porch that evening, watching the light shift across the ridge. Her hair had grown wild, sun catching on its copper threads. Her hands were calloused now, her body leaner, steadier. The life she'd run from felt distant, as though it had belonged to someone else. Jonah joined her, carrying 2 tin cups. He handed one to her and sat, the wood creaking under his weight. You still headed to Elkhorn? He asked. She sipped, then set the cup down. I don't know. He didn't look at her, just studied the tree line. There's work there, he said after a moment. A new store going up, blacksmith looking for help, I heard. Clara watched a squirrel dart along a low branch. There's work here too, she said. Jonah turned to her then. His eyes were tired but no longer hollow. You mean that? I wouldn't say it if I didn't. Silence again, but not from fear this time. It was the pause before something fragile takes its shape. That night a soft rain began to fall. Jonah stoked the fire while Clara dried herbs near the hearth. When a crack of thunder rolled low across the valley, she flinched without meaning to. Jonah saw. He crossed to her slowly, then stopped a step away. Still storms in Kansas. Only in the sky, she said. The rest lived in that house. He nodded. You don't have to talk about it. I know, but I might want to, one day. He stepped closer then, and his hand reached out, not to take, but to offer. She let him touch her shoulder, just a brush, and for a long moment they stood there, close but not clinging, firelight moving across their faces like something blessing them. Outside, the rain sang soft against the roof. Inside, neither moved to end the moment. The days lengthened. Rain gave way to warmth, and the land drank deep. Wildflowers crept along the edges of the clearing, yellow and violet and stubborn. The creek ran stronger now, laughing its way downhill, and the air carried the scent of pine and new earth. Clara began rising before dawn. She feed the mare, stretch her arms skyward at the edge of the porch, and listen. Not for danger, not for pursuit, those habits had dulled, but for something quieter, a sense of being meant. Jonah would come out soon after, sometimes saying nothing, sometimes with 2 mugs of coffee, and they'd sit on the steps watching the morning unfold. One such morning, a wagon rolled into the clearing. They heard it before they saw it, the creak of wheels, the clatter of harness. Jonah stepped forward first, hand near his belt, not on his gun but close enough. Clara stood just behind, her breath gone still. The wagon carried a man and a woman, older, weathered, their clothes plain but clean. The man tipped his hat as they pulled to a stop. Name, Harwood, he said. We're headed to Elkhorn, heard there's a store opening soon. Storm near cost us our mule, wondered if we might buy a bit of grain or trade for kindling. Jonah relaxed. Clara stepped forward. We've got both, she said. Come around to the barn, you can rest the horse a while. The Harwoods stayed the afternoon. Clara brewed tea, and the woman, Mary, shared her bread recipe while Jonah and the man fixed a warped wheel. It was easy, that kind of day. The kind that felt stitched with light. But as the sun dropped low, Mary turned to Clara on the porch, her voice quiet. "That your husband?" she asked, nodding toward Jonah. Clara hesitated. No. Mary studied her a moment, eyes kind but sharp. Could be. Clara said nothing, but the words stayed with her. After the wagon disappeared down the trail, after supper had been cleaned and the fire banked low, Clara stood near the doorway, arms wrapped around herself. Jonah sat at the table, fiddling with a strip of leather. She watched his hands, how steady they were, how they never trembled unless grief came near. "Jonah," she said, her voice low. He looked up. "You never asked what I was running from." He said nothing, just gave her his eyes. "My father traded me," she said, "to pay off his debt, promised me to a man with land and power and no soul behind his eyes. I ran the night before the wedding, wore my mother's old cloak, took nothing but a name I wasn't ashamed to speak." Jonah stood, came to her. "I'd have killed him," he said softly, "if he'd followed you here." "I know," she whispered, "but he didn't, and I'm not running anymore." He reached out, touched her face like it was made of something rare. His thumb brushed the corner of her mouth, and she leaned into him, not because she needed saving, but because he knew better than to try. Their kiss was quiet. No hunger, no firestorm, just warmth, a slow meeting, the kind of kiss that said, "I see you, and I'm still here." Weeks passed. Jonah taught her how to cut fence posts, how to track deer by hoof shape and droppings, how to mend a roof so it didn't leak come summer. Clara taught him how to braid cord from dried grass, how to mend torn shirts without the seams bunching, how to whistle low to calm a restless mare. They never spoke of the future in grand terms. No wedding, no promises carved in stone, just days, one after the other, building something that felt like home. One morning, Clara planted a row of seeds near the porch. She dug with her hands, dirt under her nails, sun on her shoulders. Jonah watched her a long while, then knelt beside her. "Tomatoes?" he asked. "Maybe," she said, grinning. "Maybe wildflowers. I didn't label the sacks." He chuckled. "I like the not knowing." "So do I." That night they lay together on the cot near the fire, her head on his chest, his arm tucked beneath her. Outside, the stars burned steady. Inside, the world was quiet. Clara closed her eyes. She had fled an arrangement built on silence and control, on blood debts and bargains struck without her voice. But here, in a cabin at the edge of the world, with a man whose grief matched her own but hadn't hardened him, she had found something better. Not rescue. Recognition. She did not belong to him. He did not belong to her. But side by side, scar to scar, they had built a life that asked for nothing more than presence and patience. And every morning, when the light returned, they met it together.